to you. I'm here to kind of like just present, and you guys make the decision yourself what you think about the Bible, what it is, what it isn't, how we got it. But I do want to close with this last session. I do want to make a case for the Bible. And I'm just going to ask, because this is kind of like one thing leads to another. I'm just going to kind of go through this. That again, especially for this one, if you have a question, just let me get through this, and then I'll address the questions afterwards. So we've been talking a lot about why the Bible is not just a book; it's a collection of ancient manuscripts written in a period of over 1,500 years by 40 different authors on 3 different continents, and why we've seen evidence that points that this is just not a book. That there was man's activity, and there's evidence of definitely God's activity in preserving it and for keeping it, and for us to be able to have it in our hands. So, despite all that, I know people have questions and doubts, and that's never going to go away. By the way, that's never going to go away. Again, you can have all the facts and people are still going to argue with you. You know that in just general comments. You can lay everything out and people are still going to go, no, or I don't buy that, or, I just choose to whatever. And again, that's fine. And if you're like that, or maybe you feel somewhat about that, I don't know. But I want to make a case for the Bible. And this is not original with me, so let me just qualify this. I'm borrowing from Andy Stanley. I'm borrowing from Daniel Wallace. Some others, but again, Andy Stanley, I think, popularized this case, but again, like him, like me, we all stand on the shoulder of people who have gone before us. So I just want to be clear, I don't want to claim credit here. If you like, oh, that was cool, okay, that's great. I'm utilizing some other material that I've heard that I thought was really good, that it touched me. I thought it was well done in making a case. So I'd like to, if I can just have your permission, I'd like to just share that with you as well, and just talk about a case for the Bible. So I want to start with a premise, and here's the premise. Okay, the premise is this. Okay. That we're going to build a case on, okay? We're going to build a case on this, okay? That the 4 gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John in the New Testament, are reliable testimonies, reliable records of something that happened in history some 2,000 years ago. And if that's the case, if that's true, then what the 4 gospel accounts say about Jesus is true, because what the 4 gospel accounts talk about, and if the 4 gospel accounts say about Jesus is true, then he must be the Son of God based on the miracles he performed and the claims he made and the fact that he rose from the dead. And if in fact he is the Son of God, then what Jesus says about God is true and relevant to our discussion. Then what Jesus says about the Scripture is true. Okay? You see, unlike all other religions in the world, I would say we have history. We have events. We have eyewitnesses. We don't just simply have a book that some prophet claimed, God told me to write this down and you need to believe it. We don't have that, okay? We have something completely unique. We have 4 different accounts of one man's life, okay? And when it gets down to it, it is these 4 books that really are foundational for our faith. It's not saying that we don't believe the rest of the Bible, but these are probably the most important books in the Bible. And so if these are reliable accounts of actual events, then what they say about Jesus is true, then what Jesus says about God is true, and what Jesus says about his word about the Bible is true as well. And that's the premise we're going to build on. So again, when it gets down to it, a case for the reliability and trustworthiness for the whole Bible really can be laid to rest by arguing for the reliability and trustworthiness of the 4 gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? Because these 4 books claim to record perhaps the most epic event in recorded human history. Okay? So, 2 things to keep in mind as I'm making this case is this. Anytime we're talking about something that has happened in history or anything that's happened in the past, you can't prove or disprove anything that's happened in the past. Let me say that again. You can't prove or disprove anything that's happened in the past. It's not a matter of proving. It's a matter of looking at the evidence. That's why in a courtroom, you don't really prove anything. They present the evidence, the jury looks at it, and they make a decision based on that. So whenever we talk about the past, we have to ask the question, what does the evidence point to? Okay? What does it point towards? Or another way of putting it is this, the trustworthiness of any historical account is judged and based on evidence. We could be talking about the Bible. Any historical account is based on the evidence, not proof. That's important. So, next Monday afternoon, you could walk into the dining hall downstairs and you could say, hey, you know what? Yesterday I went to church. And someone could say, no, you didn't. You say, I did go to church. And they go, prove it. You say, well, I got a bulletin. They go, that doesn't prove anything. Well, they were selling this book. This author was visiting. I bought one of the books. Here it is. He says, that didn't prove anything. You could have bought it on Amazon. They say, hey, Rick, come on over here. Rick, didn't you see me at church yesterday? Yeah, I did. And they go, well, that doesn't prove anything. You could have told him to say that. He could be covering for you. He could be lying. So whenever it comes to asking the question, did something happen in the past, you can't prove it. You can only prove what is observable and repeatable. That's a scientific method. You can only prove what is observable, or at least it should be the scientific method, I should say that. What is observable and repeatable. Okay, that's what it's supposed to follow. But here's the thing. You can't observe something unless they invent a time machine. You can't observe something that's happened in the past. And you can't actually, in real time, repeat something in the past. So you have to base your decision on what the evidence says. So as you're looking at the evidence, you can't ask the question, what is a possible explanation? No, you have to ask the question, what is the most probable explanation? You see the difference? Okay. In other words, when you're looking at evidence of past events, probability takes precedence over possibility. Okay? So going back to our example, is it possible that you stole the bulletin to say you went to church? Is it possible you had someone get you that book? Is it possible you got to Rick beforehand and told him, hey, say this? Is all of that possible? Yes. But the most probable explanation is you went to church. Okay? Again, in the legal system, they don't ask what is the possible cause. Because there could be 50 of those, they ask what is the most probable cause. Based on the evidence presented, that's how you determine what happened in the past. That's how history is validated, in a sense, okay? So here's the thing. We've been looking a lot at evidence. And, kind of look at even more. And yet the most probable explanation as to why 4 different men wrote 4 similar accounts about a Jewish carpenter's life over a period of 3 years is that this is what actually happened. That's why they wrote it. Now, there are 2 categories of evidence when we talk about the Bible. We've talked about some of these already, all right? One of those we spent a lot of time on. We already talked about the biblical manuscripts, okay? The Bible, again, is not just a book, okay? Collection of ancient manuscripts. The second category of evidence, when we talk about making a case for the Bible, and one we're going to spend a lot of time this morning, is on the 4 books themselves and the authors themselves, okay? So some of you probably, how many of you remember taking world history or something, what do they call it now? Where you learned about the Roman Empire? Any of you remember studying the Roman Empire? Okay, one of those, right? You probably heard something like this. Caesar realized that he could not win power without a loyal army, so he made himself proconsul in Gaul, a region that today is known as France. In the 10 years as proconsul, Caesar brought all of Gaul under Roman rule, showed his superb ability as a military leader and organizer. Caesar issued written reports about his campaigns, victories to keep the people in Roman form. Students in Latin can still read these reports in what is known as the Gallic Wars. If you ever read something like that, you ever asked yourself the question, how do they know that? Where did they get that from? Now, what they have, though, is ancient manuscript. By the way, we only have 10 copies of the Gallic Wars. Okay? Written in the 1st century by a guy who was hired by the emperor, okay, to write the history. Now you guys are smart. Let me ask you a question. Can you trust anyone who is hired to do something like that? To write about someone's life or their history? Can you?
When they have power over them?
Yeah. Literally, you're either going to scratch that part of my life out or I'm going to scratch you out, right? Okay, yeah. So we have 10 copies of the Gallic Wars, first century. The earliest copy we have is 900 AD. We don't have anyone from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, so on. We have a copy of 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 a copy that stretches out to 900 AD. But yet, no one disputes the fact that it's history, that these events happened in the past from this one guy's account, okay? Another source of evidence we have is by a guy named Tacitus. Tacitus is quoted all throughout Roman history. Tacitus wrote by the end of the 3rd century. He wrote 30 volumes of Roman history. We only have half of them. We only have 2 copies of those halves. And, that's all we have. 2 copies dated, 900 AD, 1100 AD, copies of copies written afterwards, thousands of years old. But if you were to go in high school or college and your teacher or your professor says, I want you to write a paper about Roman history, and if you turned in the paper and said, I don't believe any of this happened because it's on the source of one person. The earliest manuscripts we have is 900 AD, and besides, he was working for the Roman Empire, so it's suspect. I don't think any of this is true. What do you think your high school teacher or professor is going to say?
Not what I asked you to do.
You think that you're going to get an A? No, they're not going to go, great, that was so insightful. That is brilliant. I'm so glad you're not afraid of, I'm so proud of you. Here's a little me wow sticker. No. They're going to go, hey, just write down what I taught you. Just write down what you see in the book, okay? Now, you wouldn't expect the Roman history to be something. We could expect that Roman history could survive. I mean, you had all these Roman empires writing stuff down. They copied it. They had it stored. They had all Rome's wealth and power to protect it. So we can expect that, it's not out of the question to think that these things happen. But would you expect to have 4 detailed accounts of the life of one man, a Jewish carpenter who was from where? Yeah. Nazareth, Galilee. He didn't lead anything, in a sense. I mean, in a sense. Like, he did lead his followers. He didn't write anything down. We have more information about Jesus than any Roman emperors of his day. Okay? And you have all the power of Rome. And that we have more information about Jesus. As we saw, the 4 Gospels are not alone. Again, we have thousands and hundreds of copies, 5,800 copies of the New Testament. We have Gospel of the Gospel accounts. The earliest ones we have, again, dated just 25 years from the events that were written down. And they're not just found in, around that area. They're distributed widely. Oh, that's one of the things they look at. Is distributed widely. We got stuff from Egypt and all sorts of other things. So ask yourself, why in the world would so much attention and time be spent recording the life of a Jewish man? Not all of his life, just 3 years of it. I mean, the Roman historians, they would capture the whole life or a whole campaign or a whole rule of, But these guys, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just give us 3 years of a Jewish carpenter's life. It survived all throughout the ages, but not only that, we have far more copies of any other form of ancient history or any other form. We have more copies. The question then may be, well, Mike, why don't secular scholars or scholars in general consider these books as history? Okay? Why don't we read in the history books? Tacitus wrote this. Matthew wrote this. I mean, if there's more manuscripts, better manuscripts, more broadly distributed, less textual variants than any other thing, why aren't the 4 gospel accounts considered history? When we have 4 guys talking about someone compared to just one guy who was paid. I think it's very simple. The problem is, I would argue, and there's other problems, there's a prejudice against the supernatural. And it goes like this. Before I look at the text, I want you to know I don't believe in the supernatural. Okay? It's not that I don't believe in God. It's just I don't believe in supernatural things. I mean, God did stuff like that, but I just don't believe that Jesus walked on water. So before I look at the evidence, I want you to know that I don't believe in the supernatural. And anytime I see the supernatural, I'm going to go, whoops, that must have not been historical. Okay? So a lot of it's discounted. And the fallacy of that type of thinking, which gets intellectualized in the academic community, it's a fallacy. It's foolish. It's illogical. It's illogical to judge the authenticity of an ancient manuscript according to our own personal 20th and 21st century biases. To say that since I've never seen the supernatural, since my mom, dad hasn't seen the supernatural, I've never seen it, my friends, I just believe we don't live in the world of supernaturals. Therefore, I've concluded that supernatural things never happen. And that doesn't make sense. We can understand an emotional resistance to viewing these books as reliable because of the supernatural. I can understand that. But that's not the problem with the books. It's a problem with the orientation that we've imposed on them. So, they'll take the word of someone working for the emperor over four people writing about the 3 years of some person's life, basically because Tacitus doesn't mention the supernatural. So he's trustworthy. And you say, that's ridiculous. It's kind of like someone saying this, I don't believe the Holocaust happened. There are people who say that, by the way. You say, what do you mean? What do you mean the Holocaust didn't happen? We got pictures. He goes, I don't care. Those are forged, got Photoshop. We've got museums. So what? I don't think the Holocaust happened. I know something happened, but it's not the way history recorded it. Because for the Holocaust to happen, there would have to been a category of hatred and racism and insanity that was so powerful that it can not only impact one person, but an entire nation. And I just don't think that exists. The reason I don't think that exists is I've never thought that way. My friends have never thought that way. I've never experienced that type of racism and hate. I've never seen that. And so before you tell me about the Holocaust, I'm just going to let you know, regardless of the evidence you show me, I've already decided that because that hatred and racism and evil, I've never seen it, I don't believe it exists, this must have not happened this way. Okay? I know it sounds silly, but here's the point. Just because we've never experienced something doesn't mean it didn't happen. I mean, you wouldn't want a jury to come in with that type of predisposition when listening to evidence when it came to you, right? I've already decided, although it's kind of getting that way, right? But that's why God in his wisdom did not allow just one guy to write it down. We were skeptical. God did everything possible to capture what happened and protect it so you and I can have it today. And I would say what we have in these 4 books, I think the most probable thing that happened is Jesus actually said and did what was recorded. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? And if that's the case, we have reason to pause, right? That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's not saying we've proven anything. Again, we can't prove anything. All we're saying is look at the evidence and ask the question, what is the most probable cause as to why we have these 4 books and why they say what they say? So that's the case of the first century evidence. But the manuscripts, going back to, that's manuscript. Let's deal with the second category of evidence I told you we wanted to talk about, okay? That is with the books themselves and the authors themselves, okay? All right? Matthew was what? What was Matthew? Tax collector. He wrote as an eyewitness, okay? He wrote what he heard and saw of Jesus. John was also an eyewitness. He too wrote and heard what he saw. Mark, on the other hand, he was an associate of an apostle. In particular, he worked for Peter. Peter was the eyewitness. He got his information from Peter, okay? And then Luke is the most unique of all, because Luke wasn't even an eyewitness. He was an investigator. He was an associate of the apostles, sure, but he was just an investigator who sat down and pulled together information he can gather from the eyewitnesses and wrote it down in such a way. Why? So he can sell it and make a fortune, make a bestseller? Why do you write it down? So he can hand that account to a friend. To a friend. Look later, Luke chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. Yeah. He was handing it to a friend. Luke was a believer. He believed in Jesus like us. But here, just like everyone here, you and I have not experienced firsthand seeing Jesus die and being raised from the dead. We are not firsthand eyewitnesses. We're like Luke. Luke was the same way. He collected information from the eyewitnesses and the apostle, okay? He's the most unique. So originally the book of Luke was not written to spread around the world. You can buy it. There's no plan to I'm going to write this. We're going to take this on a world tour. And I'm going to combine it with these 3 other books. Luke was just a doctor who said, I'm going to write all this down, what you said. I'm going to tell you where I got this stuff from. You, Theophilus, will have an orderly account about Jesus. He didn't have any clue that this was going to be part of a canon. That wasn't the plan. He was just simply writing in order to hand it to a friend. So we've got 2 eyewitnesses. One who got his information from another eyewitness. One who gathered all of his information from another eyewitness. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is this. What are the possible explanations as to why these 4 books exist? We've already talked about some probable cause. But let's pull back as skeptics, all right, for a moment. Let's talk about some possible explanations as to why the gospel accounts exist. Remember our premise. So if these things are accurate and this is the most probable thing that happened, then it has all the implications for the whole Bible. We're trying to make that argument. So again, but let's go ahead. Possible explanations. It was collective fabrication. 4 guys got together in a room somewhere and said, hey, Jesus is gone, man. The dream is dead. We got to keep the dream alive. So let's make up some stories about him, write them down, pass them around to the followers of Jesus. And John's like, hey, I got this idea. Let's say Jesus walked on water. Luke said, that's a good one. I'll put that in as well. Mark said, I'm going to leave that one out. Hey, no problem, Mark, Oh, I got one. Remember those blind guys that used to hang out over there? Yeah. What happened to them? I don't know. But let's say Jesus healed them. All right, I'm going to talk about one. You talk about 2. So one possible explanation is it was collective fabrication. They all got in a room. They fabricated this
They all
stuff.
say the same thing.
Second possibility, explanation why we have the gospel accounts. Collective confusion. They got together and John's like, I think he walked on water. Did he heal someone? Yeah, I think maybe that was it. I don't. So they all have the same confusion. They're all confused. That's one possible explanation. The other is individual fabrication. Matthew went off, made this stuff up, wrote about Jesus. John did the same thing. Mark did the same thing. All these guys went out and made up their own stories. And it just so happens when you put them together, they tell the same story with a few differences. And they even came up with some miracles. It's amazing, right? 4th possibility of why we have it. Individual confusion. They were confused. They wrote this stuff down. They kind of, it's kind of happened. I kind of remember something. So they had the same confusion. Now, those are just some possibilities. And you've probably heard some of those. Yeah. Is it possible that that's what happened? Yeah, it's possible. But what's the most probable thing that happened based on the evidence? Now, just so you know, those 4 views are not shared by any scholar today. Not even the secular ones. Over time, they're no longer shared. No one in the academic community holds to those views because they know that none of them can hold water, okay? And here's the reason why. If we just had Matthew, you could hang any one of those 4 views on him. He made it up. He was confused. If you just had Mark, you could do the same thing. If you just had John, you could do the same thing. But the idea that 4 different people, 2 eyewitnesses, 2 that interview eyewitness, the idea that 4 different people could come up with a storyline that was so similar yet different, none of those 4 possible views can hold any water. No one takes any of those seriously. None of them. Okay? Because we just have too many people going on record about the life of Jesus. Okay? There's just too much written. There's too much stuff. Okay? And so I would argue again that the most probable conclusion is this stuff really happened. Okay? Further evidence is this. When you read the four Gospels, you find exactly what you would expect to find from four different accounts. Remember what I said? When we take science and archaeology and you look at all the manuscript evidence, we can conclusively say that we can reconstruct the exact words of the New Testament to 99%. And some of you looked at me like, why not 100? And I said, no, that's good news, actually. And I said, even though that 1%, it's nothing to do with doctrine. We know exactly what they are. We know exactly what happened. But again, we find exactly what happens when you have four different accounts of the same person. And this is huge when we talk about the Bible. I'm making a case. If you have several people writing about the same thing, what happens? People emphasize different things. People include different details. You find agreement on the general flow, but some people leave certain things out. The story may begin the same and end the same way, but you got four different things, and there's some apparent contradictions in that. So what this means is that several people are telling the story on the same surface, and you have they look like contradictions. The difference they differ on emphasis and details. And again, if there were only two of that, that'll be one thing. But the fact that you have four talking about the same man's life with different emphasis, different details, same flow of the story, best news of all is this: we have contradictions. That is, guys, that's good news. So next time someone says to you the gospel contradicts themselves, you should go this. You should say, you know what? When they say the gospels contradict each other, you should go, yeah. Isn't it great? Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful news? Why is it great? Because if there were no apparent contradiction, it would be evident. It would be evidence that these four guys got together in the back of the room and got their facts straight. The fact that there are apparent contradiction is evidence that there was no collaboration. They didn't get together to get their story straight. Yet there is a general flow of the story. It's evidence that they also didn't fabricate the whole thing either. You get the same thing. If you watch the Super Bowl tomorrow, I don't know. How many of you are going to watch the Super Bowl tomorrow? Yeah. Okay, I'm thinking of the last good Super Bowl I watched was the one where the Denver Broncos played. I'm sorry, I'm from Colorado. John Elway. How many of you saw that game? John Elway. He's playing. He runs, dives into the end zone and scores. Right? Each one of you, if you saw that, you may speak, when you tell that story, you may talk about how much time was left in the game. Okay? Maybe one of you is like, do you know how old John Elway was when he did that? And how that affected his performance. Some of you may talk about, man, did you see that hit he got as he crossed the goal line? And he kind of did one of these numbers, right? And again, you're going to emphasize different details, and it may seem like maybe we're contradicting each other between the different stories. But we would have the same beginning. We would all say, the Denver Broncos won. I don't know when that's going to happen again. I just don't know. But hey, and here's the point. That play took less than 30 seconds. What do you think it would look like if you were to record someone's life for 3 years as you experienced it? The more time you have to record, the more variation, the more differences, the more things to be left in, the more things to be left out, which is exactly what you find when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew talks about Jesus, two blind men. Luke tells the same story, only talks about one. Matthew says Judas hangs himself. Luke says nothing about that, talks about him falling off a cliff, his belly being spilled out. Gross, right? Obviously, these guys didn't get together, but they both recorded a tragic end of Judas's life. Again, though, the theme is the same. The flow is the same. The details and emphasis are different. You say, Mike, which one? I say, read it for yourself. Read it for yourself. Figure it out. It's both, in my opinion. I just mentioned that, say, when four people are telling a story, especially a very long one, not a 30-second one, 3-year story, months or years after the event, okay, there are going to be lots of differences. And again, that's exactly what you find in the 4 books, the 4 gospel accounts. So I would say this: thank you, God, for the apparent contradictions. Because if there were no contradictions, we would be suspect that these guys got together. And they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes and everyone else's. Okay. There are other evidence about these men themselves. Let's think about this. How famous did these guys get after these accounts came out? Anybody know? I mean, how rich did they get? Anybody know?
Didn't they all get murdered?
I love the bluntness there. Did they get rich and famous? I mean, if these guys had written a best-selling book, appeared on the talk shows and Famous Thrones, the emperor wants to see you. Oh, you wrote that book, man. Oh, man, you're going to be on live with Kathy Lee and Julius Caesar. I don't know. I'm just saying, you know, if they did this and they got rich and famous, I would say you have reason to suspect. Maybe they sort of came up with this stuff, right? But again, remember what I said earlier. They didn't even put their names on it. They were trying to get rich and famous or well known. Okay? Do you know what happened to these men? Somebody kind of basically said it, right? These men, as well as all the other disciples, spent the rest of their lives preaching a message that was considered cultic. They were accused of cannibalism. Why? Because, you know, Jesus, that whole, if you eat my drink, you eat my blood, you know, drink my blood, eat my... People are like, these guys are cannibals, man. Crazy. They had to meet in caves. They had to meet in secret. They were arrested. They were persecuted. They were tortured to find out, hey, what's going on in these house meetings? Matthew was burned at the stake. Andrew was crucified. Peter was crucified. John was exiled on an island and left to die. These men weren't perpetrating a lie in order to gain anything. Okay? The fact is, they lost everything. Matthew most of all. Matthew was rich. He was well known, popular in the culture of prostitutes and other tax collectors. He walked away from all of that wealth in order to spread this message. So there's no reason to pin on them thinking they fabricated this for their own benefit. They benefited from nothing, okay? And most significant, all of these men died. You say, why is that significant? It's significant in this way. These men, let me say it this way, these men died not for what they believed. That's not unique. On 9/11, terrorists died for what they believed. That doesn't make their message true. Just because someone is willing to die for something they believe, that doesn't make it good. It doesn't make it true. Okay? People have done that. That doesn't prove anything. But listen, this is the difference. These men died for, here's the difference. These men died for what they believed they saw. Okay? That's a huge difference. You read in the book of Acts and earlier messages of men, their message wasn't this. You've read it. Hey, Jesus has done some good things, man. It wasn't that. The message was, Jesus rose from the dead, and I saw it. Okay? See, the central pillar of their teaching, when we read the gospel accounts, it wasn't just simply a teaching. We don't have simply a belief. We don't have a philosophy. When we read the gospel accounts, it's not about, okay, here's a better way of life. It's an event in history, and they went to their graves saying, we believe Jesus is the Son of God. He rose from the dead. That not only makes their death and martyrdom significant, but it makes their testimony and their account worth listening to. Here's the thing, and I've heard it this way. A man will die for the truth, but a man will not give his life for what he knows is a lie. A man will lie in order to live, but a man will not lie in order to die. These men gave their lives because they believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. That is overwhelming evidence that these books, that what the most probable explanation is, this happened. Okay? It's evidence, as Josh McDowell used to say, demands a verdict. It's evidence that points to the reliability of these accounts and saying something happened in history. And again, it's not one testimony, it's not two testimonies, three. We got four. Four different testimonies. Now, once again, reason people say, they don't give historical credibility to this is because, again, they have a bias against supernatural. They've never seen it. And, they've never seen the supernatural in their lives. And, we live in this scientific academic community. That's the bias that's there. And so here's what they have to do. They have to come up with a different explanation because of the evidence is too strong. It's undeniable. Okay? When you take in all four different accounts of the same man's life, all pointing to the existence of the man, okay, all saying what he did. So what you can't do is they can't dispute the existence of the literature. We just have way too much of it. Again, just in the New Testament alone, we have over 25,000 manuscripts, 5,800. Last time I talked about this, it was 5,006, and now years later we're at the 58. Who knows by the time next time I teach it may go up more. 2,000, Old Testament. There's too much evidence. So how do you explain it away? So what do you have to do? Well, scholars don't say collusion. They don't say fabrication. They don't even say these people were crazy. So the most plausible theory about why these books exist is this. Here's what they have to say. Matthew didn't write Matthew. Mark didn't write Mark. We don't know who the heck Luke is, but he didn't live in Jesus' days. John didn't write it. What happened is, Jesus came, died. Like most people die, he died. And yet some people still believe that, there are rumors that he was still alive. And so these rumors grew, and years later, we supposedly have these accounts. And so this guy by the name of Fred, let's call him Fred. Fred said, you know what, I'm going to write this stuff about Jesus, And when he gets done, he says, I don't know who's going to read this. So, I'll just call this the Gospel of Matthew. They'll believe that, People take that serious. So I'll take some of these things, throw it in there, talk about some true things about Jesus, mix it in with some other myths about some miracles. Now, is that possible that happened? Yes. But again, we're looking at this from a legal standpoint. We're looking at the evidence, and the question is not what is possible, but looking at the evidence, what is the most probable thing that happened, right? So, yeah, it's possible, but the problem is, we don't just have Matthew. We have Mark, Luke, and John. So what they do is, in this secular theory, those other people, let's call him Joe. Joe said, hey man, I can do one better. So he writes it all down, and he's like, I'll call it the Gospel of Mark. And then Bert comes along, and it's like, I can do even better than both of you, and I'll write this down, and he calls it the Gospel of John. That's what they have to do. Now, I know all of this sounds silly, but this is how the secular theory goes to discount it. But here's the problem that people really, if you push it to a corner, you cannot get around Luke. Luke is the biggest problem. If someone is going to make up this stuff, they would at least use the name of an apostle. By the way, that's what happened in the second centuries. Yeah, they would at least use the name of the apostle if they're going to make this stuff up. They would at least use a name that people heard of, maybe an apostolic name. How about a biblical name like Michael? I like the sound of Matthew, Mark, Mike, John. I'm kidding. Yeah. But seriously, why in the world would someone use a name like Luke? Right? Who's Luke? Especially someone, he doesn't even claim to be an eyewitness. He's just like, I know the eyewitnesses, and I'm an investigator. I'm a doctor. I just put together an orderly account. The problem is there's just too much corroborating evidence, too many witnesses. Is it possible that that's how we got the Gospels? Yes. But the most probable explanation, when we look at the two different types of evidence, the manuscripts, the biblical authors themselves, the most probable thing is it happened. But a lot of people deny the historical accuracy of this. People can't accept the fact that a man performed miracles, claimed to be God. So they just have to stick with what's possible. And so they would say that these books were written way after many years of these events. Long after these guys are supposedly dead. But here's the flaw in that theory, okay? It's why we spend a lot of time in looking at the manuscripts, okay? The problem is our earliest New Testament Gospels, okay? We have some, again, the Romans, 800, 900. If all we had were these gospel accounts that were dated 800, 900, way long after the existence of these men, we can make a case for it. The problem is that's not the case. When you look at the manuscript evidence itself, it all points to the fact that these manuscripts, these books were in circulation while these guys were alive. That Matthew wrote his gospel most likely 50 AD, while there were still eyewitnesses. Luke around the same time, while there were still eyewitnesses. And that is why it's really incumbent on the academic community to keep pushing these dates of authorships way back beyond the life of these guys in order to keep this theory alive. But as time goes by, guys, and archaeologists continue to make discoveries, and more studies come out about how manuscripts were distributed and all these textual questions. Okay? In other words, if a manuscript is dated here, but it's found here, how long will it take from Judea to this part where we would have so many copies? And if you look at the science and the research, it keeps pushing it back to the dates of when these people were alive. Now, 1963, an Oxford professor, PhD, Sherman White, he did a study. His study was this: how long does it take for history to become legend? In other words, when you look at all cultures, and they pass on stories, and then these stories of an actual event, and somehow then they become legend. Okay? So he did the research. He looked at all these different cultures and all these different stories and the time and what would happen where history no longer became history and it became legend, myth. And he came to this conclusion, after looking at all the cultures and all the stories, that it takes at least 2 generations. So what's the problem with the secular theory? There's not enough time for this thing about Jesus to become, there's not enough time. Okay? There's not enough time for this to have taken, like something, for people, something happened in history, but then it became legend, it's myth, it got, all these things happened and people conflated the truth. There's not enough time. Okay? And so we see that and we go, okay, I understand. All right. I know we're not talking about the legend of Sleepy Hollow. We're talking about Jesus, right? And our temptation, I think, is to think that the people back then in Jesus' days and before were stupid. Right? Listen, people back then were not stupid. Okay? I know that it seems that way, People back then did not believe that people came back to life. Okay? Sure, they had a superstition of ghosts after people die. That's interesting. Okay? But they weren't stupid. Okay? Large portions of the religious leaders back in Jesus' day, they were like, I don't believe anyone rose from the dead. They're not superstitious. They're not stupid. They weren't given to this. So how in the world do you get people in the first century to believe a man who grew up over there? They saw him as a little boy. They know exactly where Mary was. How do you get people who saw him alive get to go, oh yeah, he died and he rose again? And yet, again, how do you get that? And that's exactly, though, what we have in the manuscripts and the gospel accounts. So the evidence, I would say, the most probable explanation is this is what happened. This is history. So I would say this to you. In my opinion, our Christian faith is not based on blind belief. But your faith as a Christian is based on historic fact. The best case we could take with science and history and how we come up and determine the truth. there's a solid foundation that we have to know this happened in history. It's the most probable explanation. Okay? And here's the thing. These events actually happen. And notice, it's not the book of Jesus written by Jesus. Right? That would be too easy. That would be too simple. But the book of Matthew, written by Matthew, an eyewitness. The book of Mark, written by a guy who got it from another single eyewitness. The book of Luke, written by a guy who got it from a whole bunch of other witnesses. The book of John, written by John. Does that prove anything? No. But again, the question we have to ask ourselves, what is the most probable explanation as for the existence of these 4 books? And you see, the manuscripts take away the opportunity that there was all these time that passed and circulation. And so here's the thing. I'm going to go back to the premise. The bottom line is this. Okay? Premise I made. If the 4 gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are reliable accounts of history, that's the case. If that's true, then the most plausible explanation is that what they say about Jesus in the gospel accounts is true. And if what they say about Jesus is true, that he's the Son of God based on the miracles performed, the claims he made, the fact that he rose from the dead, if in fact he is the Son of God, then what Jesus says about God is true. And yes, what Jesus says about Scripture is true. It's the Word of God. Questions? Let me pray. God, thank you for the fact that we don't have to drop our brains at the door. We don't have to check our brains, our intellect. I mean, I know you ask us to respond in faith, but it's never blind faith. I mean, even the stars out sky is evidence to your reality, your existence. You have built into nature, this beautiful place we're at right now, evidence of you all around. And there's the draw for people to respond in faith. Your Spirit is working. The winds are blowing. And God, many of us here, we've responded to that. We've responded in faith. And I just thank you that you have protected your word, that you've divinely inspired it. And when we look at the evidence, we look at the manuscripts, we look at how things happened, the conditions that exist, and yet we still have your word, it's nothing short of a miracle. God, I pray for all these students, whatever information we shared this week, that you would use it in their life. God, I just pray that it wouldn't be information, but it would be inspiration. That, God, they would act on it. And God, whatever way it is, to serve you, to teach, to fund, to translate your word. God, I don't know what their journey holds, but I thank you that this week we got to experience a little of that journey together this week. I pray that anything that I've said that may have been misleading, or maybe I just goofed because I'm imperfect. I'm not inspired. God, that you would work through that. Your Holy Spirit would correct. And God, that you would see us to know who you are and what you want for our lives. And we'll keep telling the story of how you're working in our life. Help us to be a part of this story and what you did. We thank you in all of this, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let's get up, Mike.
All right. Lunch.
Lunch.
Thank you.
You guys